Hey, Lake Elmore Community Church, great to have you with us today, whether you're watching this on Sunday or maybe later on in the week. Last week we took a week off from our 10 Words series we're in, and if you weren't able to watch that, I'd encourage you to do it. A buddy of ours named Mike was up here, and he and his family are doing some missions work over in Uganda, so he got to come and speak and share, and it reminded me of Proverbs 25:25. It says this, like a cold water to a thirsty soul, so is good news from a far country. And it was just so encouraging to hear what God's doing in their lives and through their team in Uganda. So check it out if you didn't, and don't want you to miss out on that. So today we're back and we're going to look at the second word, the second commandment, from our 10 Words series. And the reason we call it 10 Words is because the Jewish tradition basically is called the 10 Commandments, the 10 Words for a long time. And last week we had our buddy here, Mike, and then the week before that, though, Kevin shared about the first commandment, no other gods before me. And as Kevin mentioned, there was over 100 gods in Egypt that we know about. There might even be more that will be discovered over the years. But what happened was God delivers his people from this country, this place where they'd been enslaved for so many years, and they worshiped all kinds of gods. They had gods for everything. And it was only about 50 days after their deliverance that God gave them these 10 commandments. So think about this. They'd left Egypt. They're in the wake of 10 plagues to accomplish that release. Israel's only contribution to freedom was to arise in obedience as those walking from death to life. And God introduces the 10 Commandments to his people by reminding them that he is the Lord, their God. And he prompts them with, remember Egypt. So think about this deliverance for a minute. It wasn't just leaving behind the land, although it obviously was that, but it was also leaving behind the ways of Egypt. Each of the 10 plagues was more than just a dramatic sign. It wasn't just that to show Pharaoh to release them, but it was a symbolic defeat of Egyptian deities. Osiris, whose bloodstream was believed to be the Nile, bleeds out before his worshippers when Yahweh turns the Nile into blood. In reverence to Heket, the frog goddess of birth, Egyptians regarded frogs as sacred and not to be killed. Yahweh slays them by the thousands. Egyptian gods governing fertility, crops, livestock, health, they're all shown to be impotent before God. And in the 9th plague of darkness, Yahweh demonstrates his rule over the sun god Ra, whom Pharaoh was actually believed to embody himself. And the final plague, the death of the firstborn, God showed himself supreme over the entire Egyptian pantheon by demonstrating power over life and death. So the message at Sinai is clear. Before you can obey me as the God of the 10 words of life, you must revere me as the God of the 10 plagues of death. And so I hope that you're able to hear that message last week. Again, if you didn't get to that, you can go back 2 weeks on the webpage or podcast or app or whatever and check it out. This is a stark contrast. Imagine living in Egypt and living under the rule of the Egyptian authority where they just had feasts and worship and they would pray to and make sacrifices to all these false gods and goddesses. I have a couple photos up here because we got to visit Egypt several years ago. The first one here is just Marlo and a group of girls. And this is really interesting. We're at the Cairo Museum in this one. And just quick story, but everywhere we went that day, we were with a tour group with just my wife and I and this tour guide, and there were school kids everywhere, especially at the museum and out at the Sphinx, which will be another picture here in a minute. But all these girls would come up to Marlo, and they were kind of giggling and laughing, and they would talk to our translator, and they would ask if they could get a photo with her. So she was like a celebrity that day, and we kept going, what's going on? This is weird. They don't want me in the picture, obviously, but it was always just with Marlo. And what the guide, our translator, told us, he said, these kids are from rural areas, and it's a school day, and they're here with a school trip to go to the museums, and they don't come here very often. And they almost never have seen a white person before, like an American. And so they were just thrilled to be able to get her photo. So that was a little bit random, but it happened over and over again that day, so we just laughed and laughed. But the next one here in the museum, this is from the King Tut exhibit, and you see these gold statues these idols that represented the pharaoh and different gods and goddesses. And there's just stuff everywhere in that museum. It's spectacular, but also a little heartbreaking. Then, of course, the Sphinx outside. You see these pictures with the glasses and the kiss. It's like the tourist thing to do, I guess. But there's just towers and statues to gods and goddesses all over the place that have been unearthed, and some have just been have stood for a long time, including the giant pyramids that are tombs of the kings and pharaohs. And this next one, just one more photo, was some of the transportation we saw there. It's just a bunch of people on a little motorcycle, no helmets, just going for it. Thought that was interesting too. So we saw in the first commandment, God and God alone is to be worshipped. And coming out of this land, Egypt, this was radical, this was new. But next, we're going to see the power and detail about the danger of idols. Having no other gods before me, the second word gives us more instruction on this. And I want to divide it up today like this. First, let's look at the rule, so what the commandment is. Second, the reason for the commandment. Third, a warning for when it's not followed, and then finally a promise for when it is. And so the rule, the reason, the warning, the promise, and then we'll just apply it in three basic ways. So let's read it. If you have a Bible, you can open to Exodus 20, verse 4. You can turn that on if you need to pause the video for a minute and go ahead and do that. And we're going to read Exodus 20, 4, 5, and 6. It says this, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments." Let me say a quick prayer for us before we continue. God, we come to your word asking for your Spirit to enlighten our eyes, help the eyes of our hearts to see what we need to do about your word. God, may it not just be some academic study, but would it be a way that your commandments bring life to us and continue to change us and make us more like Jesus. Thank you for today. Thanks that we can open your word together. Amen. So let's start with the rule. What is the rule here? Well, it's pretty clear. It says don't make, worship, or serve lesser gods, basically. And so how is the second commandment different from the first? The first one said, have no gods before me. This commandment is actually the longest, by the way, of the 10. It's got the most verses, the most words, basically. And in one way it's different. The word addresses in the first commandment idolatry in general. Just no other gods before me. But then in the second commandment, it gets more specific. We shouldn't make images of created things and worship them as creator. So worship the right God, the first commandment basically says, and the second says worship the right God in the right way. Or don't worship false gods. That's the first one. But then it also says in the second, don't worship the true God falsely. So how we worship is as important as whom we worship. This helps us see the relationship between the visible images and the invisible God. There's a relationship. And with all the commandments, by breaking the second, we also break the first. When we want to worship God in a way contrary to his command, we set ourselves up to be God. So with any of God's commands, if I say, God, I'm not going to do what you say, we're basically saying, I'm God, I'm king, I'm in charge, you're not. So what is the commandment? It seems pretty easy. It forbids the making of an image of anything in God's creation. So it says on earth, terrestrial, celestial, in the heavens, or anywhere for that matter. Just don't do it. But it doesn't ever stop at just making the idol. We see here in the verse that idol worship is progressive. It's not just about you can't have a statue. That's part of it. But it says do not make, do not bow down, do not serve. So that statue, it represents something and it has a purpose. It's not like you create an idol and just set it aside and you never do anything with it. Idols were used for something very particular. When I was in college, there was a Thai restaurant near our campus that we just loved to go to. And it was really interesting because it had Thai food, like a little fast food kind of takeout place with a few tables, and then it had ice cream, the best of both worlds. And so the lady that worked there, we got to know her because we went in there a lot. Her name's Pookie, it's probably a nickname. And we would talk to her, and she was really friendly and super nice, and like had great food, great ice cream. And every time you go in, though, I'd notice there'd be a shelf kind of behind the cashier up high on the wall, and there's a little statue there, a little Buddha. And then every day there was some food next to it. And I went in there enough times to notice sometimes the food was a little bit different. And so one time I asked her, what's the story there? What's that for? And she said, well, that's part of my religion. And she kind of explained a few things. And I said, what about the food? Is it, what do you do with it? And she said, well, I throw it out every day. And I thought, well, that's just crazy. The idol doesn't eat the food. I didn't get in her face about that, but I said, well, that's really different. It's really interesting that there'd be this statue there. But it was a part of the way she would offer food to the Buddha. And I believe I don't remember all the details now, but something like this helps my business be successful and my life go better, and just to have that kind of that peace about that. So the Buddha idol was there, and it wasn't just a statue on a shelf. It was a part of her life. She brought food to it each day and then threw it away and cleaned it out and made sure everything was good and did the whole thing over and over again the next day. So it's progressive. Something that we made that we treat like the maker. This is what we're talking about with this image thing. Image management is an interesting thing. I read recently that Franklin D. Roosevelt, even though he was disabled by polio, he required that the press never photograph him in a wheelchair because he wanted to show an image of strength. He didn't want this frail image. One that I read about in one of the books reading for the study was Queen Elizabeth I of England. I'd never heard this before. Maybe you know this. But 3 years into her reign, smallpox left her with facial scars and partial baldness for the rest of her life. And as she got older, she lost so many teeth that her speech became impaired. But in the portraits painted during her lifetime, she's always youthful and beautiful. Why is that? Well, because she made a decree that it would be that way. Listen to what Sir Robert Cecil, who was her Secretary of State, wrote. Many painters have done portraits of the Queen, but none has sufficiently shown her looks or charms. Therefore, Her Majesty commands all manner of persons to stop doing portraits of her until a clever painter has finished one, which all other painters can copy. Isn't that awesome? Her Majesty, in the meantime, forbids the showing of any portraits which are ugly until they're improved. That's hilarious. And they actually developed a template, a face template, and they called it the Mask of Youth. And so all artists in the future had to adhere to those standards of beauty. She wanted to make sure that people saw her in a certain way. Obviously, God's approach is quite different to his image. He doesn't need to manage it. But in a sense, he calls us not to create these images and worship using those. Why is that? Well, here's the reason. We saw the rule, don't make these images, don't serve them, don't bow down to them. But the reason for that is basically, it says, for I, the Lord, your God, am a jealous God. The reason is God's zealous or jealous love. God is zealous for his glory. And when we use the word jealous, we usually mean envy. And we think about it like negative. Like, I'm jealous of the car that guy has, or the house, or whatever, his wife, or whatever. We're jealous of that. But jealousy that God has is different. It's right, and it's righteous. And one writer said this, it's inflamed by denial of what is rightly his. Listen to one quote. This is a guy named Christopher Wright, a theologian, wrote this. A God who is not jealous would be as contemptible as a husband who doesn't care whether or not his wife was faithful to him. Part of the problem with this profound covenantal reality is we've come to regard religion, like everything else, as a matter of consumer choice. So we think about religion as choice we have. We resent monopolies, but unique and incomparable, the only living God makes necessary exclusive claims, and he has the right to a monopoly on our love. Jealousy is God's love protecting itself. I like that. Jealousy is God's love protecting itself. So in order for God to preserve the reality of his perfections, all that he is, and all his greatness, and all his attributes and characteristics, God says no human will make an image of me. You're not going to do it. Why is that? Because any such image would only cloud or diminish our understanding of what he is truly like. Whatever we could create is not going to represent God well enough. It's not going to be able to capture it because he is infinite and invisible. So any finite or visible thing can only dim our understanding of his true nature. This is very interesting. While the first word, the first commandment, prohibits the worship of anything other than God, the second prohibits worship of any version of God that is less than God. So this is the reason, because God is jealous in his love for his people. God desires that his people love him. And we have an object lesson right after this. And you remember the story. This is in Exodus 32. If you want to flip over there, you can. I'm just going to read a little bit. But before Moses even comes down the mountain, what did Israel do? Do you remember this? Listen to Exodus 32. When the people saw Moses was delayed to come down from the mountain, they're like, where is he? He's been gone for so long. They gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to Aaron, this priest, up. I love that. That's the first word. Up, like get up. Make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's become of him. So Moses goes up the mountain. The people are standing there and said, listen, we don't know what happened to Moses. Make us some gods. Make us gods. This is incredible. So Aaron says to them, take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, your daughters, bring them to me. So all the people took off the gold and brought it to Aaron. And he received the gold and fashioned it with a graving tool and made, remember this, a golden what? Calf. And they said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. This is mind-boggling. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. And he made a proclamation, tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord. They rose up early the next day, offered burnt offerings, and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. This calf god that they made, this little golden calf, with gold that was most likely, it was plundered from the Egyptians. Remember that? And most likely God wanted them to use that to make things for the tabernacle, first place of worship. Not images of God, but things to decorate the place of worship with. And the people immediately, they're waiting. They can't wait any longer for Moses. They said, make us some gods. They don't say make us an image of God. They say make us actual gods. This little calf told a lie. It's this inanimate object, and it's this thing that's not of ultimate value. It's got some gold in it, but God is infinitely more valuable. It's a thing that can't walk or breathe or do anything, and God is alive and living. It's something that has no power to do anything for God's people, whereas God has all power, and they're saying, this is our God. They're worshiping this little thing and saying, this is our God, when it's in fact not. So God's jealous in his love, and God's people, we often run from him and just ignore his love, ignore his commandments. So we've seen a little bit about what the rule is and then the reason for it, but let's look at the warning. And the warning is this, basically, to sum it up. Idol worship is destructive and contagious. When we worship something other than God, it's destructive and contagious, something lesser than God. And this is just the end of Exodus 20, verse 5. He says, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. We read this kind of thing in the Bible and you're like, oh, this is the God of the Old Testament. This is why the Ten Commandments have a PR problem like we talked about in week 1 of the series. God is angry. He's like going to visit the sin, the iniquity of the fathers on the children. That's just not mean. That's not just mean, but it's also not fair. Like, what kind of God does that? Well, Ezekiel clarifies this for us. Ezekiel 18:20 says this, the soul who sins shall die. That means sins without forgiveness. The son shall not suffer for the iniquity of the father. So you're like, wait, that's opposite of what was said here. Nor the father suffer for the iniquity of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself. The wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. So what's this contradiction? I thought God said, I'm going to visit the iniquity on the fathers, or of the fathers on the children to the third, fourth generation. It's going to keep going. And then Ezekiel says, no, that's not how it works. The key is in the phrase at the very end there in Exodus 20, verse 5. It says, to the third and fourth generation of those who what? What does it say there? Those who hate me. This shows that idol worship is contagious. It's not just that the fathers sinned, or in regard to this commandment, if you continuously disobey this commandment, that your kids are going to pay for it, but your kids are going to learn from you how to disobey it. And when it says those who hate me, it's the generations that continue to turn their back on God. God says their sin will not be covered, will not be dealt with, will not be forgiven, because they're continuously turning their back on me and walking away from me. and ignoring my commandments. Idol worship is contagious and destructive. Romans 1 describes what we do about God, and this is just humans in general. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who in their unrighteousness or by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. So what does it mean we suppress the truth? Well, he continues, Romans 1:19. What can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it. How has God shown it? His invisible attributes, namely his eternal power, divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and things that have been made. So they're without excuse. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore, God gave them up to the lust of their hearts, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator. So, as humans, we are prone to worship other things, lesser things. We're prone to think we're really smart and we've got it figured out, and just say, God, that's archaic. That's for old times. That's for the Israelites. I can do it on my own now, or I can figure out a better way. It's what we tend to do, and it's destructive and contagious. Think about this contagious part. The example you set, this is especially for moms and dads and grandparents, but it's for all of us. The example we set in this curse where God says, I'm going to visit the iniquity on the children because they're going to learn to hate me from you. Think about the flip side of that. We're getting ready in a couple of weeks to Lord willing, do some child dedications here at the church. And think about the privilege it is to pass down your faith to the younger generations, your own kids or your grandkids or others' kids. God can use it in such an amazing way on the flip side of this, to not be destructive, but constructive. To not be contagious in a bad way, but contagious in a good way. Faith is passed down and it multiplies and spreads all over the earth. So that's the warning. Let's look at the promise, and then we'll apply it for a few minutes. The promise is God's enduring love, or his steadfast love, it says here. But God will show steadfast love to the thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. And some translators favor thousands of generations, but it's just meant to be a bigger number at the very least. To the third and fourth generation of iniquity of those who hate me, they will be punished. But then he says, upon thousands and thousands, I'm going to show my love for those that keep my commandments, for those that seek to follow me. So remember the very beginning of the 10 words. We talked about this a minute ago. He said, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. God loves these people. He's committed to them, just like he loves us and is committed to us. This is a reminder of the covenant relationship. It's an agreement between God and his people. God's law helps develop a loving relationship with him. Just like we read in week 1, 1 John 5:2 and 3. By this we know that we love the children of God, when we love God and obey his commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments. And his commandments are not burdensome. Commandments are wrapped up in God's loving relationship that has already been developed with us. Remember, God didn't say, if you obey my commandments, then I'll deliver you from Egypt. They're already out. These were given to keep his people free. So how can we kind of bring this home a little bit for us in 2022, here in Lake Almanar, wherever you happen to be watching from? I'm going to just say it this way. The time is now. And I want to give you 3 things to consider. First thing is this. The time is now to ask God to search your heart. You see, that the human heart does take good things and turn them into ultimate things. Our hearts deify. John Calvin said it this way. The human heart is a perpetual factory of idols. We're just continuously churning out different and new idols. One writer said it this way. The human heart takes good things like a successful career, love, material possessions, even family, and turns them into ultimate things. Our hearts deify them, make them gods, as the center of our lives because we think they can give us significance, security, safety, and fulfillment if we could just attain them. Another writer, he's a popular blogger named Tim Challies, says, in the Western world, we are far too sophisticated for carved idols. Like, we're better than that. I'm not going to put a statue on a shelf and give it food every day. I'm better than that. I'm smarter. I'm more educated. But we do have idols of our own. respectable idols suited to 21st century sensibilities. If we worship the idol of the perfect body, the sweeping curves, or the chiseled abs, we'll become as vain and self-focused as the models in the magazine. If we worship the idol of money, we'll become as greedy, selfish, and cutthroat as the worst wolf on Wall Street. If we worship athleticism, we will imitate superstar athletes in their arrogance, their moral depravity, their self-obsession, and it could just go on and on. We are prone to this. But what am I asking you to do today? What am I asking me to do? Take some time right now. Now is the time to ask God to search your heart. Be like David when he said this in Psalm 139, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. See if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." Sometimes, I would say most of the time for me, I don't even see the idolatry. I just fall right into it, or I stumble into it, or I have habits that build into it. And I need God's help. So what are your idols? I want to encourage you today, just try to think of two things that can become idols for you, that you worship in place of God. And some of these are maybe even good things. If you want some help in identifying these things, if you're married, ask your spouse, what in my life draws me away from worshiping God, or do I worship in place of God? We say things like, when the kids are good, we're good. But that's not right. We should be good. We should be okay because we have God. And we have some serious baggage in U.S. American Christianity. One of our worst exports that we've kind of sent out all over the world from our country is called the prosperity gospel. It's the idea that if you do good, then you'll be healthy. If you follow God, then you'll have a lot of money, or you'll have more than enough money. And those things could be true. You might be healthy, you might have a lot of money. But that's not the guarantee of the gospel, right? Jesus himself was what? Extremely poor. He didn't have anything. And when he even cried out to God, "Deliver me from the potential of death. Take this cup from me," God said, "No, I'm not going to do it." We've exported this all over the world, where people think that if they have God, then they're going to be rich and they're not going to be sick and everything's going to go their way. And that's just not the Bible. That's not what the Bible teaches. Sure, God blesses his people and he heals sickness, but that's not the way the Bible presents it with the prosperity gospel. What about works-based religions? Pick something like Islam or Hinduism or Mormonism or one of the other new cults we have in the U.S. We reject those. We say, "Oh, no, I believe in God's grace." But then we live our lives sometimes like, if I just do the right thing, then God will give me what I want. If I do the right thing, then God owes me something. Like I've got a little bit of spiritual capital to kind of play with, instead of realizing we're poor in spirit. Sometimes we just favor some of God's qualities over others, right? Think about just trying to list out all the ways the Bible describes God, like his nature, his character. Some people call it his attributes. We pick some that we like maybe God's love and his grace and his mercy, or his kindness, or his care for his people. Those are all awesome things that are true about God. And we focus on those and we just ignore the rest, like God's justice, his hatred towards sin, his defending the poor and the fatherless, his desire to eradicate sin from this world and evil institutions and evil things. And we don't talk about those as much, right? It's like going into Chipotle and making a burrito. I'm not going to put veggies on it. That's going to mess up my burrito. Give me more cheese, more meat, more whatever. I mean, that's a weird example. But we can't do that with God. That's a form of like false worship, when we just say, "I'm going to take part of God, but not all of him." God says, that's not you don't get to do that. I am who I am. Ask God, what have I made? What have I bowed down to? What have I carved out with my hands and I'm serving it? What am I living my life for that I should not be living for? One good way to do this is to look at where you spend your time and your money. You can tell a lot about a person, who they're worshiping, by the way they spend what they get, by the way they use the resources they have and their time. So, after you've identified two things, just pick two things. Man, maybe it is finances or resources that I love too much. Or maybe my family has become a thing that I've lifted above and put them in a place where only God could have or should have. Once you identify those couple things, what's next? Well, the next thing is, first, it's time to ask God to search your heart, to test you. Second is to smash some idols. That's the second thing. It starts with taking an axe to the root of the tree, or ripping up some weeds, getting them out of there, or melting down the golden calf like Moses had Aaron and them do, or throwing that statue into the woods, whatever analogy you want to use. It's time to get rid of it. We all make stuff or do stuff in our life or find things in our life, and we worship them, and we shouldn't. The hidden power of idols is what they do to those who worship them. Psalm 115:8 says it this way: "Those who make them become like them, and so do all who trust in them." See, these things have no power in your life, really. They become ridiculous when you really think it through. When we take something good and we can make it ultimate, we need to smash these things. There was a period in my life not too long ago where I was teaching in a university program, and we had to go through the process with several different universities to become like an accredited or okay professor for them. And so first question they would ask every time, do you have your PhD yet? And I didn't. And so I'd be, no, I have a master's degree in this or whatever. And so we go through the thing. Okay, well, here's a process you go through. And it wasn't required in the program I was in to have a PhD, but that was still the first question. So I kind of found myself like with this, it's kind of a, like I need that thing. I should get that. So I can answer, yes, I do have my PhD, by the way. Thank you very much. And so my boss at the time said, hey, you know what, maybe you should get it and we'll pay for it. And I said, man, that sounds pretty good. So I started the process and started taking some more school and working on studying some more and learning. And then we ended up moving back here to the States. And so I didn't need to do that anymore and it wasn't getting paid for, so I just stopped. But what I found in myself is, who cares if you have a PhD or not? I did. For a minute, for weeks, where I'd go to these, sit in on these curriculum committees and like present my syllabi for the course, and they'd look it over and say, okay, this is good, this isn't. But if I'd had that little stamp on after my name, those extra letters, I wouldn't have had to do some of those things. And I actually, kind of had this weird idol of success and intellectual pride and kind of going on in my heart. And I was like, what's the problem with me? And I had to realize that if my goal is to make a name for myself in this world and to become this, great professor with a bunch of letters after their name, or to have more and more people know about what a great a teacher I am, I'm making that into something and worshiping it in a way that is just ridiculous. So smash the idol. We don't just smash it. Like for me to realize, man, I really am putting too much emphasis and focus on this one little weird aspect of my life. It's not just enough to say, I'm not going to pursue that anymore. I'm not going to let that rule me anymore. But I need to replace that idol with true worship of God. And this is where I found this super interesting. I had never noticed. I've read the 10 Commandments, many, many times in my life. Memorized them as a kid, like probably a lot of you did. But I had never seen this until studying for this. So it just blew my mind. So I might get a little carried away here for some extra time. But it's time, not just to ask God to search your heart, time to smash idols, but it's also time to carve and chisel the right image. The right image. See, one has come so that we can see God. John 1:14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we've seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Colossians 1:15, he, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. Christ is the icon. He's the image. Hebrews 1:3, he, Jesus, is the radiance of the glory of God, the exact imprint of his nature. He upholds the universe by the word of his power. Jesus is the image of God. He was sent here so that we could see God, we could worship God as he truly is. See, there's nothing wrong if Jesus is the one you worship to point you to God. That's how God meant it to be. He sent him so we could actually know God. And did you know this, that every human being has been made in the image of God? The commandment says, make no image of me, make no likeness of me, make no statue of me, but God made every human in his own image, like breaking his own commandment in a sense. And he even sent Christ to show exactly what he was like. So those are two good ways that we have images or icons in this life. All people have been made in the image of God. Jesus was present in Genesis 1:26, where God said, "Let us make man in our image." Therefore, life matters so much to Christians. And this image of God, this Imago Dei, has motivated some of the greatest movements throughout the history of the world. Think of these for a second. Schools, hospitals, the abolition of the slave trade, feeding the hungry, prison ministries, recovery programs, orphanages. Almost all of these originated with Christians who believed that everyone was created in God's image. That image has been marred by sin, though. It's been affected by the curse and the fall. And God comes in and he transforms and he restores that likeness, that image. He does that by sending Jesus to perfectly reflect the image to the world and then be murdered for it and raised again on the third day. See, Jesus took all the punishment for your disobedience and mine, to all the law, to any commandment we broke, any law we didn't fulfill. He did that for everybody who worships the Creator, or the creation rather than the Creator, so that all who believe could have this forgiveness. And even more than that, listen to the way the Apostle Paul describes this renewal. For those whom he foreknew, he predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. You see, God actually wants people to see an image of him through Jesus, of course, but even through us. It's very different through us than it is through Jesus. For the Christian, our heart is being conformed to the image of Christ. It says this over and over again in the New Testament. We're being made more like him. But why? This is why. To show God to the world. 2 Corinthians 4:7 is a pretty popular verse, but this is how it describes it. We have this treasure in jars of clay to show the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. The treasure is the good news about God's love for the world. You could call it the gospel. It's the fact that Jesus came so people could have forgiveness. And it says we have this thing, and it's in a jar of clay. You're the clay pot. You're the earthen vessel. And that's a good thing. So when I say carve and chisel the right image, you're being conformed to be like Jesus, to show the world how awesome God is. You're bearing God's image to the world. And so am I as we follow Christ. 1 Peter 2 says it this way: keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable. That's Gentiles meaning the people that don't yet believe in God, that they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. Philippians 2 describes the same thing. It says, work out your own salvation. You're saved, but work it out in fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you to will and work for his good pleasure. And then later it says that you may be blameless and innocent children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation among whom you appear as lights in the world. Jesus said the same thing in different words in Matthew 5. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. In the same way, let your light shine before men or before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. See, being made like Jesus is a slow work. God calls us into that work and participation with the Spirit through his word in the church to redeem us and change us and make us more like Christ. So that the goal or the result is they could see whatever we do and not worship us. That's what you do with an idol. You worship that idol. But they could see the transformation in us and be pointed to God to worship him. You see, this no graven image is flipped on its head when Jesus comes as the perfect representation of God, the exact imprint of his nature. And then he then transforms people, saves them into God's kingdom, and helps them to bear the image of God all over the world, wherever they go, and to bring the good news of God's love. And so in that way, when I say chisel and whittle away, is work with God through his Spirit to let your life be transformed by him. Being made like Jesus, again, is a very slow work. Eugene Peterson calls this, you may have heard this before, a long obedience in the same direction. This isn't a flash that happens, somehow my life is perfect, but God chisels away. And we work in our walk with him to surrender to him and say, God, continue to transform me through the things like we have, like this long obedience, fellowship. That's the exchange of truth and relationships. Being under the teaching of God's word, just being in Bible studies and discussing the word together, hearing it preached and read and submitting to it, reading and memorizing scripture, spending time in prayer, right? Seeking to obey God, repenting of sin, taking communion together, serving the church, serving the community, sharing your faith, loving your neighbors, worshiping with God's people. It's all at our disposal. It's gifts God has given us to continue to conform us into the image, so that when we go out, people see what we do, the way we live, the way we talk, the way we raise our kids, the way we use our money, the way we just conduct ourselves, and they say something is going on there. We say, you know what? That's God. Worship Him, and that bearing the image of God points people to worship the true God. I'd never really thought about that image in that way connected to this command. So it really just kind of blew my mind. Hopefully that came across in an understandable way. If not, give me a call anytime. I'd love to talk to you more. But I want to pray for us to wrap it up, and we'll continue. God, thank you for the Ten Commandments, God. There seems like stuff from so long ago in history, but it has so much to do with my life today. God, I pray you would continue to show us how to live for you as we grow and are more conformed to the image of Christ. God, that you would change our perspective on what you're doing in our lives, God. And use us this week to go out and be a light to the world wherever you take us. We'll give you the praise and glory for all you do. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, thank you, LACC.